A leather-bound notebook sat in a cardboard box for 75 years, untouched, unread, and almost forgotten. Then an artificial intelligence system scanned every page in under an hour, and historians who reviewed the results say what it found changes the way we understand one of the darkest chapters in modern history. This is not a story about a monster in a movie. This is a real diary, written by a real man who served in the SS, and the words inside it are far more unsettling than fiction could ever be. Stick with me, because this story says something about how ordinary people become capable of the unthinkable, and that lesson matters more today than ever. Let's start with where this diary actually came from. Diaries kept by high-ranking Nazi officials are not new discoveries. Historians have spent decades tracking down personal papers, service logs, and private journals left behind by the men who ran the machinery of the Third Reich. Some of the most significant finds happened by accident, buried in foreign archives, misfiled among unrelated paperwork, or simply overlooked because no one realized what they were looking at. One of the most famous examples involves Heinrich Himmler, the man who led the SS and oversaw much of the Holocaust's operational planning. His wartime diaries were seized by the Red Army at the end of the war and sat quietly in a Russian military archive near Moscow for decades. They were rediscovered in 2013, and portions were published a few years later. Reading them, according to historians who studied the pages, is a genuinely disorienting experience. Entries describing routine massages and lunch plans sit only lines away from entries ordering executions and describing visits to concentration camps. That contrast, the mundane sitting shoulder to shoulder with the monstrous, is something historians have long identified as one of the most important and disturbing patterns in Nazi-era personal writing. It is not that these men hid their actions behind coded language or careful euphemism in their private notebooks. Many of them wrote about daily atrocities with the same tone they used to describe a family dinner. That flatness, that emotional distance, tells us something important about how systems of mass violence actually operate, and it is exactly the kind of detail that historians look for when new documents surface. The diary at the center of this story belonged to a lower-ranking SS officer, a man whose name has not been widely publicized, while researchers work to verify the full contents and confirm chain of custody. Unlike Himmler, this officer was not a household name. He was, by most accounts, a mid-level administrator, the kind of person historians describe as one of the thousands of ordinary functionaries who kept the machinery of the regime running without ever appearing in a history textbook. His notebook sat in a private family collection for generations, passed down without anyone fully understanding what it contained until it was donated to a research archive. For years, it sat cataloged but essentially unread, partly because the handwriting was difficult to decipher, and partly because a notebook from a relatively minor official simply was not a research priority compared to documents tied to major war criminals. This is common in historical archives. Institutions have limited staff and limited time, and personal diaries from lower-profile figures often sit at the bottom of a very long list of material waiting for expert attention. Everything changed when researchers began experimenting with AI-powered handwriting recognition and translation tools designed to process large volumes of archival material, enormous datasets of historical German script, including the distinctive old-style handwriting many Germans used well into the 20th century, a style that modern readers, even fluent German speakers, often struggle to read without specialized training. What used to require a specialist paleographer working painstakingly page by page can now be processed by a machine in a fraction of the time. When the diary was scanned, the AI did not just transcribe the handwriting. It cross-referenced names, locations, and dates mentioned in the text against existing historical records, military assignment logs, and known troop movements from the period. This is where the discovery became significant. The system was able to place the diary's author at specific locations during specific windows of time with a level of precision that would have taken a human researcher months of manual archival cross-checking to establish. According to those familiar with the findings, the diary confirms the officer's presence at more than one site now associated with wartime atrocities, filling in gaps that previously existed in the historical record about troop rotations and personnel assignments during that period. For historians, this kind of documentation is invaluable, not because it reveals anything ideologically new, but because it adds verified, dated first-person testimony to an already established historical timeline. Every confirmed detail strengthens the broader historical record and makes Holocaust denial, which still circulates in certain corners of the internet, even harder to sustain against physical documentary evidence. What has drawn the most attention, however, is not the logistical detail. It is the tone of the writing itself. Much like the Himmler diaries, this officer's entries shift between administrative dryness and moments of startling personal reflection. Some pages read like routine record-keeping, listing supply shortages, weather conditions, and troop morale. Other pages contain something closer to private doubt, brief, almost buried lines that suggest discomfort with orders being carried out, though never rising to outright objection or refusal. Historians caution against reading too much into these fragments. It would be a mistake, they say, to interpret a handful of uneasy sentences as evidence of secret moral resistance. Plenty of perpetrators expressed private unease while continuing to participate fully in the machinery of violence around them. Understanding this distinction matters, because it is part of a much larger and more uncomfortable historical lesson, one that scholars of the Holocaust have emphasized for decades. Most participants were not fanatical ideologues foaming with hatred every waking moment. Many were, by outward appearance, unremarkable people who followed orders, adapted to circumstances, and rationalized their participation through incremental steps that made each individual action feel smaller than the whole. This pattern has a name in historical research. Scholars often refer to it as the normalization of atrocity, the process by which extraordinary violence becomes routine through bureaucracy, distance, and repetition. Officers filled out forms. They coordinated schedules. They processed logistics. The language of administration created psychological distance from the enabled. Reading a diary that captures this process in real time, written by someone living through it rather than reconstructed after the fact by historians, offers a rare and deeply unsettling window into exactly how that psychological distancing worked on a personal level. The AI analysis also picked up something historians describe as particularly striking: a shift in tone that occurs in entries written during the final months of the war, as German forces began retreating on multiple fronts. Earlier entries carry a tone of confidence, occasionally even boredom, the writing of a man performing a job he considers routine and secure. Later entries grow shorter, more fragmented, and noticeably anxious. References to superiors giving contradictory orders increase. Mentions of confusion, resource shortages, and fear about the approaching Soviet army become more frequent. This kind of shift is not unique to this particular diary. Historians who study personal writing from the collapsing Eastern Front have documented similar patterns across many surviving letters and journals from German soldiers and officers during this period. As the war turned decisively against Germany, the once confident bureaucratic tone of many official diaries cracked, replaced by the plain, frightened writing of men who suddenly understood that the systems protecting them were falling apart. There is a grim irony. Historians have long noted in this pattern that many of these same men showed little documented empathy for the suffering their actions caused others, yet wrote with obvious fear and self-pity once their own safety became uncertain. If stories like this, ones that use new technology to shed light on real, verified history, interest you, take a second to subscribe so you catch the next one, because there's a lot more of this kind of research quietly happening right now. One of the more delicate aspects of this discovery involves how researchers are choosing to handle its public release. Unlike a viral internet claim designed purely for shock value, institutions working with documents like this typically move carefully, consulting with Holocaust historians, archivists, and in many cases, descendants of victims or survivor organizations before publishing detailed findings. This is standard practice for a reason. Personal writings from perpetrators carry real risk of being misused, either sensationalized in ways that distort their historical meaning, or worse, repurposed by extremist groups looking to twist historical documents into propaganda. Responsible historians are careful to present documents like this within full historical context, emphasizing verified facts, cross-referenced timelines, and established scholarly consensus about the Holocaust, rather than allowing isolated diary entries to be quoted out of context in ways that could minimize or distort the scale of what actually happened. This is worth stating plainly. The Holocaust was one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities in human history, supported by overwhelming physical, testimonial, and photographic evidence gathered from perpetrators, victims, liberators, and independent investigators alike. A single newly discovered diary does not rewrite that history. It adds a small verified piece to an already enormous and well-established body of evidence. What makes AI-powered analysis genuinely valuable in this space is speed and scale, not new revelation. Archives around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe, still hold enormous quantities of unprocessed wartime paperwork, personal letters, military records, and administrative documents that human researchers have simply never had the time to fully catalog. Some estimates suggest that millions of individual pages related to the Nazi era remain incompletely reviewed, sitting in archives from Germany to Russia to Poland. AI-assisted transcription and cross-referencing tools are beginning to change that reality, allowing researchers to process backlogs that would otherwise take many more decades to work through using traditional methods alone. This has significant implications beyond a single diary. survivor testimony organizations have begun exploring similar technology to help verify and cross-reference thousands of hours of recorded survivor accounts against newly digitized perpetrator and administrative records, helping historians build even more precise timelines of specific transports, camp operations, and individual fates that were previously difficult to fully document. In some cases, this technology has helped confirm details for families who spent decades searching for information about relatives whose final movements were never fully recorded. Returning to the SS officer's diary itself, researchers say the final entries, written in the closing weeks of the war, trail off abruptly. There is no dramatic confession, no closing reflection tying the narrative together the way a scripted drama might demand. The writing simply stops, consistent with historical records, suggesting the officer was captured by Allied forces shortly afterward. What happened to him following capture remains under research, and historians involved in the E project have indicated that additional archival material may eventually clarify his post-war fate, including whether he faced any formal legal proceedings. This unresolved ending is, in its own way, deeply representative of a much larger historical reality. Millions of individuals who participated at various levels in the machinery of the Nazi regime were never formally tried or held accountable in a courtroom. Some faced consequences, many did not. Diaries like this one matter precisely because they preserve a verified, documented account that exists independently of whether formal justice was ever served, ensuring that the historical record itself remains intact regardless of individual legal outcomes. It is worth stepping back and asking why stories like this resonate so strongly with audiences today, decades after the events they describe. Part of the answer lies in how uncomfortably relatable the diary's early entries are, before the collapse of the war begins to show. A man going about administrative tasks, following a chain of command, rationalizing his role as simply doing his job. That framing is not exotic or distant. It echoes uncomfortably close to modern conversations about complicity, bureaucracy, and how ordinary institutional participation can enable outcomes far larger and darker than any single person's individual actions might suggest. Historians studying perpetrator psychology have long emphasized this exact point. Understanding the Holocaust is not just about understanding hatred at its most extreme and visible level. It is equally about understanding how systems of violence recruit and sustain participation from people who might never describe themselves as hateful, people who convince themselves, entry by entry, task by task, that they are simply doing what is required of them. That is precisely why documents like this diary carry weight far beyond their individual historical detail. They function as a warning embedded in ordinary, unremarkable language, a reminder of how, gradually and quietly, moral boundaries can erode when responsibility is diffused across a system rather than carried by any single decision-maker. As AI continues to accelerate archival research, historians expect more discoveries like this one to surface in the coming years, not dramatic smoking gun revelations that rewrite established history, but incremental additions that deepen our understanding of individual experience within events already well documented at the broader level. Each verified diary, letter, or record adds precision to names, dates, and locations, strengthening the historical record against distortion, and ensuring that the full human reality of this period, both victim and perpetrator, remains accurately preserved for future generations, who will never have the chance to hear these stories firsthand. There is also a technical side to this story worth understanding, because it explains why AI succeeded where traditional methods struggled for so long. Old German handwriting, especially the style commonly known as current schrift, looks almost like an entirely different alphabet to modern eyes. Letters connect in unfamiliar ways. Certain characters resemble completely different letters depending on context, and even native German speakers today often cannot read documents written in this script without specific training. For decades, this created a real bottleneck. Archives held thousands of documents that were physically preserved but functionally inaccessible, simply because so few living people could reliably transcribe them. Machine learning models trained specifically on historical handwriting samples have begun closing that gap by studying tens of thousands of digitized pages written in similar scripts from the same era. These systems learn to recognize letter forms, common phrasing patterns, and period-specific vocabulary with increasing accuracy. When applied to a new, previously untranscribed document, the AI does not simply guess at individual letters in isolation. It considers the broader context of the sentence, cross-references, likely words based on surrounding military or administrative terminology common to the period, and produces a transcription that can then be reviewed and corrected by human experts far more efficiently than starting from a blank page. This human review step remains essential, and researchers working with this diary have been careful to emphasize that the AI's output was not treated as a final, authoritative translation on its own. Every significant passage was cross-checked by historians fluent in period-specific German, ensuring that nuance, idiom, and context automated processing. This collaborative approach, machine-assisted transcription paired with expert human verification, has quickly become the standard model for how serious archival institutions are integrating this technology, precisely because it combines speed with the accountability that historical scholarship demands. The verification process for this particular diary also involved comparing handwriting samples against other confirmed documents bearing the same officer's signature, a standard forensic step used to establish authenticity in historical document analysis. Ink composition, paper aging, and binding materials were also examined using non-destructive imaging techniques, all of which reportedly returned results consistent with the diary's claimed origin in the early to mid-1940s. While full peer-reviewed publication of these findings is still pending, the preliminary consensus among researchers involved is that the document is genuine rather than a later reconstruction or forgery. It is worth addressing directly why authenticity verification matters so much in this specific historical context. Holocaust denial and distortion remain persistent problems, circulating through certain corners of the internet despite the overwhelming weight of historical evidence proving the scale and reality of what occurred. Every new document that surfaces claiming to relate to this period faces, and should face, rigorous scrutiny before being treated as reliable historical evidence. Sloppy verification, or worse, deliberately fabricated material presented without proper scrutiny, only provides ammunition for those seeking to cast doubt on well-established historical facts. Careful, transparent authentication protects the integrity of the historical record for everyone, including the descendants of both victims and perpetrators, who deserve an accurate account of what actually happened. This is also why many of the historians involved in projects like this one have pushed back against sensationalized framing when documents like this reach public attention. A diary confirming an officer's presence at a documented atrocity site is significant to historians building precise timelines, but it does not on its own overturn or dramatically alter the broader historical understanding of the Holocaust, which rests on an enormous body of independently corroborated evidence collected over the past 80 years. The value of documents like this lies in precision and personal testimony, not shocking new revelation. That said, the human dimension of reading a real person's private thoughts from this period remains genuinely powerful, regardless of how it fits into the broader academic picture. There is something uniquely unsettling about encountering a stranger's handwriting, their small daily complaints about weather or fatigue, sitting just paragraphs away from references to events now remembered as among the darkest in human history. It collapses the distance that history textbooks sometimes create, reminding readers that these events were carried out by real individuals living ordinary daily lives, not distant abstract forces removed from personal experience. Museums and research institutions working with documents like this increasingly emphasize this exact point in how they will make present findings to the public. Rather than focusing purely on operational or logistical details, many have begun incorporating passages that reveal the mundane humanity of perpetrators, specifically because it forces audiences to confront an uncomfortable truth. Atrocity on this scale was not carried out exclusively by cartoonish monsters easily separated from ordinary human experience. It required the participation of countless individuals capable of complaining about lunch, worrying about their families, and still carrying out or enabling horrific orders without treating the contradiction as remarkable in their own private writing. This diary, once fully published alongside proper historical context, is expected to join a growing archive of similar documents being used in educational settings to illustrate exactly this lesson to new generations. Holocaust education researchers have noted that personal, verified documents like diaries tend to have a stronger impact on student understanding than statistics or summary narratives alone, precisely because they humanize both victims and perpetrators in ways that abstract historical description cannot fully achieve. As this particular research project continues, historians expect further AI-assisted analysis to help cross-reference this diary against other surviving records from the same unit, potentially identifying additional individuals mentioned by name whose own wartime activities remain unclear or unconfirmed. Each connection strengthens the broader documentary record, filling gaps that families, researchers, and institutions have worked for decades to complete using slower, manual archival methods. There's a broader shift happening here that extends well beyond this single diary. Archives across Europe are beginning to partner with technology researchers specifically to tackle these long-standing translation backlogs, recognizing that the window for gathering additional context from living survivors, liberators, and family members is closing with each passing year. Every document processed now, while some first-hand connections still exist to help verify context and detail, adds a layer of accuracy that becomes much harder to establish once that living memory is gone entirely. In that, Since projects like this one carry a quiet urgency that goes beyond simple historical curiosity, treating each newly translated page as one more safeguard against future distortion or forgetting. If you found this kind of historical deep dive valuable, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos exploring how technology is helping uncover and preserve real history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what this discovery means for how we understand ordinary complicity during extraordinary times. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.